How many men in this room have ever heard the words, "you're not dealing with your feelings"? Raise your hand. Yeah, that's most of us. And hopefully by the next 20 minutes or so when we talk, you'll have a different way of looking at that. Because I've spent about 25 years of my life working with traumatized men who were in deep trouble. And I've learned that there are different ways of handling things with men than there are with women. And let's see, is this a masculine room or a feminine room? What do you think? That's the woman in front here. What do you think? Is it masculine or feminine? Anybody? Okay, why is it masculine?
Square.
Square, good. Why else?
Everybody's facing this way.
Yeah, yes, Jim gets it. Everybody's facing this direction. Now, why is that masculine? Everything is pointed in one direction. What are the four symbols universally for the Western culture? The four symbols of masculinity, where are they? The king's staff, right? The magician's wand, the warrior's sword, and the lover's phallus. What do those four things have in common? Hopefully long and lean, right? Right, long and lean. But importantly, they all, what was that?
In their heyday.
In their heyday, he says. Well, we won't touch that. Now, think about what those four things do. They all go to one point, and they all have to do with product, outcome, efficiency, things like that, getting things done. These are the tools, the masculine tools that get things done, the action-oriented things that make it happen. What are the symbols for women, for femininity? What's the symbol, the basic universal symbol? It's the bowl, yes. The bowl. Look at the difference. What does the bowl do? It contains, it holds. Think womb. It's holding things, right? Very different. Now, what's important is these are just energies. We all have the masculine energy and we all have the feminine, right? It's a matter of how well we know our blend of those two that shows a sign of our maturity, right? Now, women can have masculine, men can have feminine. In fact, we need to love the very feminine men as we need to love the very masculine women. My wife has a good touch of the masculine. You know, when I'm talking about something, this and that and the other, and she'll say, Tom, get to the verb. Get to the verb. That's very masculine. What is it doing? Get down to the point. Get down to that thing. Get it done. Get her done, right? Get her done. That's a very masculine way of doing it. So it's not just a man-woman thing. It's a masculine-feminine thing, back and forth. But importantly, most men have more of this masculine thing we're talking about. Most women have more of the feminine thing we're talking about. Okay. When I first got out of graduate school in 1978, I was looking for a job as a therapist. I was all excited. I'm going to go to work and do some good things. Sure enough, I looked around, there was no jobs available. 3 months later, I thought, I'll get one soon. 6 months later, I thought, I'll get one soon. 9 months later, I thought, I'll get one soon. And about a year later, I was desperate. And there was one place that said, we'll take you, Golden. It was a Center for Death and Dying down in D.C. I said, I can do it. Hey, no problem, sign me up. So I get on board with this counseling center. There's 18 therapists there, 17 are women, and one's a man. That's me. So here I am, the only guy. What happens is triage as the men come in, right? And the women come in, who gets who? Who do you think gets all the men? Me. Every man that came in there came to me. Why? Why was that? Why do you think? Because the women didn't want to deal with the men. They'd say all kinds of things. These men don't deal with their feelings. These men are this way. These men are that way. And so Golden, he's a man. He can do it. Of course, what was I taught in graduate school? You sit and you face each other and you talk about the past. Do men like to face each other? No, not in the same way women do. Because what does it mean to face each other when you're a man? Instead of closeness, it means competition and conflict. Hockey has a face-off. Boxers face each other. Men don't feel safe in a face-to-face mode. They feel safe shoulder to shoulder. Men feel good about themselves and get close and intimate with other men when they're doing a common activity, especially that's dangerous. Yeah. Fire departments, the army, police departments, those are places where men bond with each other. And in some ways, we're screwing our boys over because we're trying to force them into this feminine model of, we bring in all these counselors into schools, right? After there's a crisis, we bring in a flood of counselors so that everyone can talk about it. Well, it might be good for most of the girls and some of the more feminine guys, but most of the young guys are feeling really uncomfortable because it's forcing them into a mode that's not theirs. It's not theirs at all. And I was thinking today, it's kind of like if we had, if we brought in 50 wrestling coaches and made all the girls try out for the wrestling team. It's kind of, that's the opposite of what we're doing when we bring in a bunch of people to focus on talking. My son's 19, he said the worst thing about school is it's all talking. It's all talking. I can't stand it. It drives me nuts. So here I am at St. Francis trying to get these guys to talk about things and talk about the past, right? I couldn't have done too much worse than that. Because what we've found, or what I've found since then, is that people when they're stressed, people when they're hurt, will move to where they feel safe. They'll move to where they feel safe. And men do not feel safe in a face-to-face. They feel much better back-to-back in a fishing boat. Women like the face-to-face. Now, this whole thing started making me feel like Warren said, I didn't know what the hell I was doing. What am I doing here? I'm failing. And so I had a couple of choices, quit or figure out what was happening. So I started studying the cross-cultural material about men and women and the way they grieve, and I started realizing, oh my goodness, this is something that's happening that's important. What I saw was, when you look at the tribes around the world, one of the things you find is, almost all of these tribes, when someone is grieving, they'll give the men tasks. They'll give the men something to do. They'll give the men activities. And they give the women a place to emote. Now again, sometimes they give women the tasks and sometimes they let men emote, but generally speaking, there's almost always a task for the men to do, whether it's caring for the body, digging the grave, taking care of all the people around. They give the men things to do. And think about our culture. What have we done in our culture? We've set it up so that we have subcontracted all of the things to do. Now, as men, we stand in the funeral home and we tap our foot because there's nothing to do. We got to sit there and talk. Do men like going to funeral homes? Usually not. Oh man, in Africa, there's this one tribe where the men, their job is to sing the life of the person who died. Isn't that beautiful? The men band together and they sing the life of the person who died. Oh man, wouldn't that be a trip? What a tribute. And this is indicative of what I found over and over with the men, is that men use honoring as a way to move into their emotions. They honor what's happened, which importantly, honoring pulls us into the future. Okay, does that make sense? Whereas completing the past, which is the more feminine mode, pulls us into the past. And what you find is when a child dies, the two parents are separated like this because the woman says, he's not dealing with his feelings. He's work, work, work. And he says, oh my God, she is overdoing it. All she does is cry, cry, cry. So you get these two cultures going on. What I started to realize at St. Francis was it wasn't something wrong with the men. It was something wrong with the therapy. Our entire mental health profession is geared towards the feminine mode, where they believe that if you can heal, it's only through crying and talking about it. Those two things, crying and talking about it. And men have very different ways of doing things. In fact, we've been helped tremendously by some research in 2002. A woman in UCLA named Shelley Taylor wrote a fascinating book and did research. It's called The Tending Instinct is the book. But in it, she makes the important point that all of the stress research prior to this point is only done on male subjects. So all of the things you've heard about fight and flight has to do with men. And in fact, what I found at St. Francis was it was a perfect fit, because the men would do two things when they were really, really stressed. They would move to an activity that honored somehow the loss, which is your fight part, or they would move to an inactive state where they'd pull back and process. That's the flight part. Now, these two things have been shamed over and over and over again. You know, men are shamed by not dealing with it because they're either pulling back or they're moving into an active mode. But it's important to know that these active modes are just as healing as crying and talking about it. They're just not as well known. We don't know about them. And I saw this over and over at St. Francis Center. And so I started asking men different questions. Instead of saying, what do you feel about this? I'd ask him, what are you doing about it? Because how many times if you ask a man what he's feeling, and he'll say, oh man, I'm fine. I'm fine. You say, well, what about your grief? He says, I can't do anything about that. Right? Have you heard that before? Think masculine. There's no goal, no objective. Men will find objectives to then move them into a state where they're next to the pain, right? And by that, they're dealing with their emotions. They're processing things in their own way. It just goes more hidden. Anyway, Shelley Taylor did this wonderful research where she realized that men were the only subjects for this stress. Then she looked at, well, let's just do women. What do you think she found? What she found was women, when they're stressed, don't fight or flight. Women, when they're stressed, tend and befriend. Tend and befriend. Google that one. You'll get loads of data, but it's very important for us to know because what it tells us is when women are stressed, they will move towards interaction. When men are stressed, they will move towards action. It's a very important bifurcation right there that tells us that men are going to do things differently. And they have a very different way of doing things. And because men don't do it in the way women do it, doesn't mean there's something wrong with them. Now, Taylor went a step farther. She found that there were hormones underlying all of this. What she found was that there's this hormone called oxytocin. Anybody heard of oxytocin before? Yeah. They call it the cuddle hormone because when you get a burst of oxytocin, you want to come up and cuddle people. You want to hold people. You want to get close, right? So both men and women, when they're stressed, get a burst of oxytocin. It's natural. Taylor looked underneath this, and what she found was the woman's estrogen amplifies the effects of the oxytocin. Women really want to hold. They really want to cuddle. And the man's testosterone negates the effects of the oxytocin. Physically, he does not have the same need to move towards people and to hold. This is really important data for us to know because men have been shamed for a long, long time for not doing this. Think about sex. It's a nice thing to think about. After sex, we all get a burst of oxytocin, right? Guess what happens? The women say, oh, let's cuddle. And the man says, nope, the game's on. Right? Right? And that's what's happening. Underneath all of this is a physical reason for it. You know, the men's testosterone has negated his oxytocin. The woman's estrogen has pushed it up. She wants to cuddle. We're very different. You know, there's another hormone called prolactin. Prolactin is a pituitary hormone. It has to do with our emotional tears. The more prolactin we have, the easier it is to cry. The less prolactin we have, the harder it is to find tears. So who do you think has more prolactin? You got it. The women have more. What's really interesting is children have about the same levels of prolactin growing up. When I was a little guy, 7, 8, 9 years old, and I was growing up in the D.C. area, I was following the Redskins and the Senators. Man, they lost all the time. I was crying and crying and crying. It was great. It was just great. Then when I got to be 12 years old, the tears dried up. I stopped crying. And looking back in graduate school, I thought, oh, I was just trying to be a tough guy, you know. But physically, what happens then is the man's prolactin goes down right when his testosterone goes up. There's an inverse relationship between the two. So men have a much more difficult time connecting to their tears following a loss or when they're very stressed. There's some beautiful African rituals where the men in the tribe will come up and stand next to the women who are keening and wailing. And they do this in order to resonate their own pain, because they know they can't get it going in the same way. So they stand next to someone who is just vibrating like crazy, and by that, they then start to vibrate. We're very different. What I found at St. Francis was there are a number of different paths that men take with these activities. There's the creative path, where men do creative things that help them connect in with the pain. One guy did this, it was a son I worked with, and his father, when his mother died, the father put a block of walnut on the dining room table. Over the next 2 years, the father carved that into a bust of his dead mother. Now, can you imagine as a child watching your father carve a bust of your mother on the table as you're grieving for your mother? Can you see how every time that man took a chunk out of that statue, he was in his feelings, he was in his emotions, he was working with it? But he didn't talk about it, right? Another man used to take walks. His wife and he would take walks every day. Went to the same place. When his wife died, he'd take the same walks. He'd tell me, he said, man, I cry the whole time I'm on that walk. Then I come back, then I'm okay. People at work don't know he's doing that. Everyone thinks, oh, he's not grieving. He looks fine to me. He's got his own safe place where he goes and he processes. It's a practical thing. First is creative, the second is practicality. He uses practicality to connect in with his pain. Trust funds, scholarships, all kinds of things like that are ways, practical ways, that men have found to move into their pain, in next to their pain. And then there's the thinking mode. A lot of times men will use their thinking mode to tell their story. They'll use the thinking to move up next to the emotions. There's a guy wrote the book, C.S. Lewis wrote the book Grief Observed about his wife's death. Now C.S. Lewis was actually giving us an archetype for what happens. It's a man who's using his strength to create a product, and the product will live on into the future, and the product helps him connect in with his pain. Can you see how that was his way to connect in the same way that some woman might tell the story in a support group? There's nothing wrong with support groups. Support groups are fine. They're just not for everyone. When Christ was in trouble, what would he do? He'd go into the desert for 40 days and 40 nights. And I don't remember Mary following him saying you need to join a support group. She let him be, and today we need to let men be. We need to honor that sometimes pulling back is a healthy move. Sometimes moving into action is a healthy move. We've got to honor our men for who they are and what they're doing. And think of Fathers for Justice and what they're doing. This is action. They're taking their pain, they're putting it into action. This is the masculine path of being able to integrate your story, moving it into yourself, and doing something about the future. It's the masculine path. Let's see, what did we leave out? There's probably a lot of stuff. It usually takes a couple hours to get this stuff out, but we've kind of condensed things down here a little bit, and we've probably skipped over a number of things. I forgot to tell you about boys. When my daughter was little, she was about this tall, she'd come to me and she'd say, Daddy, I need special time. And I'd say, oh, Julia, we knew just what that meant. We'd pull up 2 chairs and we'd face each other. And she'd say, oh, Maura doesn't like me. Oh, Julia. She'd say, and Lindsay says I'm fat. Oh, Julia. And we'd go on about 7 or 8 aw Julias. Then she'd be fine. Thanks, Dad. Boom, she's gone. Now, what was she doing? She was creating a safe place for herself. She was creating a safe place where she could tell her story, integrate things, get support and understanding, and then boom, she's gone. Did my son do that? Did he come to me and say, Daddy, I need special time? No, no, no. What did he do? What do you think?
I don't want to talk about it.
Well, he'd do that too. What else would he do?
Jump on your head.
Yes, in fact, that's close. He would say, his cue was, I want to wrestle. I want to wrestle. That meant to me, Daddy, I need special time. Because when we're wrestling, as we're wrestling, he'd have me down like that on the floor, and all of a sudden he'd pop his head up and he'd say, so-and-so got beat up today. I go, oh, that's awful. And then he'd have me back down again, and then he'd pop his little head up a couple minutes later and he'd say, I miss Granddaddy. Oh, God. My heart would just go, clunk, and I'd say, oh, I'd miss him too, Luke. And then he'd have me back down again. Now, can you see how he was using that activity as a mechanism to tell his story? Do you see how it works? Even stoics are just another way of being able to tell the story, because you are not emoting outwardly in honor of whatever. So it can be another way to integrate what's there into your being. Unfortunately, our therapy industry doesn't acknowledge that a lot of times. We need to learn that people are diverse. People have different ways of doing things, and particularly men need to be honored for the way they do things. Now, little boys are particularly different because they have this thing called testosterone. And importantly, little boys, when they're 2 months in utero, get this first testosterone flood. But at 4 years old, boys get the second testosterone flood. And at 4, what does that do? They get about half of what they're going to get when they're 12, and this testosterone makes them want to jump off the top bunk. It makes them want to test the tensile strength of their muscles and bones. And any parents know what happens about 4 years old. They jump, 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 they run, they do all kinds of things. And what do we do to them? We put them in school and we tell them to sit still, be quiet. So here they've got all this energy, this curiosity, this creativity that's bundled in this physical movement, and we strap them in. You know, we're doing crazy things. There's a Waldorf school, I don't know if people know about that, but the school is based on learning through action. So the kids learn through moving, through doing and moving. Anyway, about 4 years old also for little boys, what happens is that they go through this thing with mom. They call it the first separation from mother. Because at 4 years old, what happens? You know, the little boy comes up to mommy and he puts his hand on her breasts, right? Oh, no, you can't touch me there. He says, what? Why can't I touch you there? Because you're a boy. He said, well, wait a minute. Susie does this. She's grabbing you all the time. She's a girl. So the boy has to learn then, you know, I am now cut off. And this is the beginning of when young men start to learn how to pull back and do things on their own, because they're forced into a situation where they don't have their point of origin as a touchable source. You can't go in the bathtub anymore with mom. You can't do anything. So a lot of times this is overlooked. And this helps boys in a lot of ways, I think, to become independent, their own people. But it's a stressor that a lot of people don't think about. And it's one that I think we need to acknowledge and honor. And let's stop right there. Any questions about what we've said?
You have a book?
Yeah, I wrote a book called Swallowed by a Snake. It's back there on the table. Swallowed by a Snake, The Gift of the Masculine Side of Healing. And it's about the gift of the masculine side of healing.